This is a reading of the first part of an Aristotelian dialogue concerning the geocentric and heliocentric cosmologies, Contra Galileo, which I am the author of and which you can find a copy of in the archive and Amazon links below. Again, I wrote this as a formal response to Galileo's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, as a defense of the Aristotelian and Ptolemaic geocentric model of the cosmos, and a refutation of the Copernican heliocentric model of the cosmos, as portrayed by Galileo and as argued for by him in his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, which this is a response to. This will cover the first part of the first book. Pontifex Urban VIII. You, Galileo, and you other followers of Copernicus, like Salviati and Sagredo were, and you onlookers and listeners, you have been summoned here by the authorities of Rome for a contest against and a formal evaluation of the new doctrines of Galileo and Copernicus, about which Galileo will be compelled to defend the Copernican cosmology, as he is their greatest proponent against the Aristotelian thesis. He will be defending the Copernican theories from the challenges and refutations posed to him by Simplicius of Cilicia, the great commentator on the writings of Aristotle. I then hand over the role of conducting the discussion to you, Simplicius, to interrogate Galileo as you wish and as you see fit. Simplicius of Cilicia. To begin, Galileo, do you and the Copernicans not propose theories that displace the stationary Earth from its place at the center of the cosmos in exchange for a stationary sun at the center? And don't you further argue for irregular cycles and imperfections of the heavenly bodies in denial of the separate and different substance and nature of the ethereal heavens from that of the sublunary elemental bodies, with your culmination taking place in the claim that the heavenly spheres and the bodies carried around in them are not eternal, ingenerated, and incorruptible? Galileo, yes, and shamelessly, with exception of the last point about our denying the eternality of the heavens, for that claim hasn't been laid against us by our opposition as of yet. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then tell me this. In your vain presumptions of making the earth seem to be no different in substance and motion from the luminaries, is it your intention to drag down the heavens into the sublunary and changing realm, and to throw the earth's position and station into confusion? Or do you really consider yourselves to be saying something that raises the earth up from the interpretation of its place in the cosmos handed down to us from the ancients? Galileo, we consider ourselves to be following the trail of truth without concern to the authoritative doctrines of the ancients. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then, since this isn't a trial, but a discussion summoned by the authorities of Rome, since you have already been sentenced to house arrest and stand the future charges of influencing a variety of like-minded writers, you may contest with me about the two chief world systems, the Aristotelian and the Copernican cosmologies. And know that such is not as much of an invitation, but as you know, an order from the court of Rome to present your arguments for the Copernican system and state your qualms with the Aristotelian cosmology. I waste no effort in asking you what few points you disagree with the Aristotelian worldview, since, as I understand, you take up arms against every single postulate, premise, conclusion, and even anecdote. So we will have to survey both of the two chief world systems, the Aristotelian and the Copernican, in a discussion that will either end in the remedy of your mental and intellectual distortion or in another trial with greater implications, given your influence on your contemporaries since the time of your mild sentence under the authorities of Rome. Galileo, I submit to your inquiries. Simplicius of Cilicia, then I hope also that you submit to the rules of argumentation. Now, it is clear that the two different views of the world differ in two manners. First, that the Aristotelian side claims the ingenerability, the indestructibility, the incorruptibility, and the inalterability of the cosmos, while the Copernicans claim the alterability, the destructibility, and generability of the same cosmos. And second, that the Aristotelians place the earth as unmoved at the center of the cosmos, while the Copernicans displaced the earth from the center of the cosmos and granted a variety of motions. Now, since it would be difficult and unorderly to begin with yours, the Copernican estranged conclusions, since you avoid demonstrative argumentation and attack or rather merely deny Aristotle from irregular angles, we are forced to begin at the beginning in order to find any common footing for our arguments. And since in your own work, titled The Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, you yourself began with Aristotle's premises and gradually strayed from them and contended with them, until, alas, you left not even a single postulate, let alone proposition, untouched by your slander. We will begin where you began, at the onset of Aristotle's arguments taken from his lecture notes on the heavens. I will seek your agreement throughout the whole from there, and we will contend with each other or agree, since, as I and many others suppose, you misrepresented the philosopher's arguments, and I will play the part of Simplicius or Simplicio, through who, as a literary mouthpiece, you profaned the arguments of the great philosopher Aristotle. Otherwise, if we begin with your rash conclusions, I'm afraid there will be no common footing to take up arms in the course of argument, since it is clear that you don't use premises and synthesize conclusions in your observational claims. Galileo, then let us begin at the beginning with Aristotle's first premises in his own work on the heavens, as I did in my work, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. Simplicius of Cilicia, are you and your friends Salviati and Segredo, that is Filippo Salviati and Giovanni Francesco Segredo, familiar by way of instruction with Aristotelian physics? Galileo, we claim to have understood scholastic physics to a higher degree than even their own adherents. Simplicius of Cilicia, then, as they have both since passed away, and before that, Filippo Salviati fled Florence from the Medici family, after also being warned about the complaint received by the Holy Office regarding his heresy. And Segredo was accused of espionage around the same time. You will have to speak for them, for you use them as your mouthpiece in your dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. And know that you are defending yourself and the Copernican system by speaking for them, as those are what are left at stake. Galileo, it is second nature for me to speak for them and for the Copernican worldview also, as you know, since I use them as my mouthpiece to speak for me and the Copernican cosmological system already. Simplicius of Cilicia, then let us proceed with the argument. Galileo, at your lead. Simplicius of Cilicia, you must agree that the science which has to do with nature concerns itself with bodies in magnitudes and their properties and movements, do you not? Galileo, of course. Simplicius of Cilicia. And what say you about the principles of bodies and magnitudes? Does an understanding of them on their own right provide us with a greater understanding of bodies and magnitudes and their movements that comprise nature and the processes of nature? Galileo, I assent, yet I wish you would explain the difference and what principles you suggest. Simplicius of Cilicia, and I yield to your wish, Galileo, as much for my own pleasure as for the sake of the argument. You distinguish between shapes and the science of shapes, that is geometry, and bodies which by necessity have shape, and the science of the movements of those bodies, that is physics, do you not? Galileo, I do. Simplicius of Cilicia. And don't you say along with us that the science of shapes in and of themselves, I mean geometry, has certain principles from which we gather an arsenal of propositions useful in demonstrating conclusions? Galileo, yes. Simplicius of Cilicia. These axioms, or postulates as we call them, are taken to be self-evident and impossible to doubt, granting us a sturdy foundation from which to construct demonstrations of other propositions and conclusions. Axioms or postulates, then, are what I mean by the principles of a science. The following are such axiomatic and self-evident truths that cannot even be doubted. A point cannot be divided. A line is a length without breadth. The limits of lines are points, or in other words, lines are bounded by points. The limits of surfaces are lines, or likewise, in other words, surfaces are bounded by lines. Is that clear to you? Galileo, it is. Simplicius of Cilicia. Do you also consent to the statement that the science of geometry as a whole is set over and above the science of motion or physics as a whole, as a sort of principle? What I mean is this. Physics, or the science of moving bodies, insofar as it has as its subject bodies or magnitudes, and since bodies are comprised of shape or figure, and insofar as the motion takes place along linear spaces, along the outline of some shape, that science, physics is dependent upon and bound together with geometry, the science of shapes in and of themselves. What response have you to the claim that no proposition in physics could be stated without adopting or employing geometrical terms? Galileo, I consent also to that, although I reserve the doubt that bodies in the world fail to achieve the definitional form of purely geometrical shapes. Simplicius of Cilicia. Such a doubt I also hold, and such need not be dwelt upon yet. Nonetheless, you must admit that we are required to use geometrical terms such as straight, circular, spherical, surface, plane, flat, round, continuous, point, line, and so on in our discussions about physics. Galileo, yes, even if we use the geometrical terms in a less precise sense when applying them to physical problems. Simplicius of Cilicia. I should interject the course of the argument to remind you that the relationship between geometry and physics is one way and not reciprocal, for geometry never takes anything from physical inspections. Galileo, yes, I know. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then, since we are in agreement about the claim that physics has to do not only with bodies and magnitudes and their movements, but also with the principles of bodies and magnitudes. We might move on to the general course of the argument. Galileo, you may go on with the argument. Simplicius of Cilicia, you admit that the magnitude that we call a continuous line is always capable of subdivision. Do you not? Galileo, yes. And that a line, Simplicius of Cilicia, and that a line is divisible in one way or by one interval only? Galileo, yes. Simplicius of Cilicia, and that a magnitude which is divisible in two ways or two intervals is a surface? Galileo, yes. Simplicius of Cilicia, then do you also agree that a magnitude which is divisible in three ways is a body having volume, as we say? Galileo, yes, that also. Simplicius of Cilicia, and these we call dimensions. Divisibility along one, two, or three ways or intervals. Galileo, yes. Simplicius of Cilicia, are not surfaces distinguished from lines and bodies from surfaces by the addition of a perpendicular line? I'll provide the reason for making after illustrating such a qualification. Not by the addition of any random line is the result of a further dimension passed to from a given figure. Take a surface, for example. A line that projects the area in line with and along a plane of the given surface doesn't grant the figure a third dimension. For the given surface was only capable of division in two ways, length and width, and an additional extension of the length or width wouldn't and doesn't add the interval or dimension of depth to the given surface. Only by extending and protruding the surface in the direction along an interval that runs against and across its superficial intervals of length and breadth is the interval of depth added to the prior surface. That is, by the addition of a line perpendicular to the lines that determine and measure the two other intervals of dimension. And of course, the interval of width is added to a length by the addition of none other than a perpendicular line through the center of the given line. Or at least, even if we admit that width or breadth is added to a given line or a length by the addition of a second line that is not at right angles to the given line, we refuse to measure the second dimension of breadth by any line that is not at right angles to the given length. And likewise, in the measure of a volume or a body, if the dimensional lines are not set at right angles, there is no value in our calculation of the volume for lack of angular definitude. As then, the mensuration of the intervals of dimension depend on perpendicular lines set at right angles with each other. We say that the dimensions of length, breadth, and depth are set perpendicularly and at right angles from each other. Do you follow the argument? Galileo, yes, I follow. Simplicius of Cilicia, then answer this. Galileo, what? Simplicius of Cilicia. Upon the intersection of three perpendicular lines of interval, is it possible to draw a fourth that is perpendicular to them? You must realize that from a line of a single dimension, an additional perpendicular line of breadth that intersects the prior line of length divides the angular space equally, and that a further additional perpendicular line of depth that intersects the two previous intervals of length and breadth also divides the whole angular space equally. So I ask, is it possible to draw a fourth line perpendicular to the three intersecting lines that carve out the intervals of length, breadth, and depth that divides those prior intervals equally without allotting disproportionate spaces among the prior lines of interval? Galileo. I would never wish to claim that a further interval or dimension is possible to pass to from the third dimension of depth. Simplicius of Cilicia. I will read the portion of your work that agrees to this point, which is altogether most important to the Aristotelian cosmological argument. So far, I am glad to see that you are in agreement with our premises. You have your friend and mouthpiece Salviati state that it will necessarily follow that the one which is to define the breadth leaves the first at a right angle. That which is to denote the altitude, which is the third dimension, going out from the same point, also forms right angles and not oblique angles with the other two. And thus, by perpendiculars, you have determined the three dimensions. You have Salviati continue, also in alignment with the Aristotelian premises. And since clearly no more lines can meet, in the said point to make right angles with them, and the dimensions must be determined by only straight lines which make right angles with each other, then the dimensions are no more than three. And whatever has three dimensions has all of them. And that which has all of them is divisible in every way. And that which is so is perfect. Now, I commend your use of syllogistic style of argument there, although admittedly you were discoursing about the Aristotelian cosmology, not the Copernican. And those arguments were from Aristotle's On the Heavens. Yet at that point, the characters you have arguing for the Copernican worldview agree with Aristotle thus far. Is that right? Galileo. That is right. Simplicius of Cilicia. Well, I will pass over the fact that your character Simplicius or Simplicio, who is supposed to be modeled after me, that he doubts the basic premises or the basic principles of the Aristotelian argument, while the Copernican adherents state no qualms and even are presented as the ones presenting and teaching the information to the Aristotelian who has doubts about them, which I cannot understand. And then after that, their roles are reversed when contentions are made against the Aristotelian doctrine, so that Simplicio or Simplicius defends the scholastic view from the refutations of the other interlocutors, when they were the ones who were teaching to him, the supposed Aristotelian, the premises and the first arguments of Aristotle's On the Heavens. We will continue with the Aristotelian argument from there to discover your own and presumably Salviati and Segredo's point of departure from agreement with us. Galileo, that is well with me. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then, since we have agreed that there is no other dimension of magnitude beyond the three, since what is divisible in three dimensions is divisible in all directions, we need not take up arms in the argument about whether or not we can pass beyond body or volume to a further kind as we passed from length to surface and from surface to body by way of perpendiculars. And it will remain settled that body is complete magnitude. Aristotle says that, and you must agree, given what you said before, that we could only pass beyond the dimension of body in virtue of a defect of it. And that which is complete cannot be defective, since it extends in every direction. Galileo, with which I am in agreement, both as I conceive the question now and as I presented Salviati and Segredo as saying in the dialogue I wrote, the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. Simplicius of Cilicia, you admit, do you not, that nature is the principle of movement and that natural bodies and magnitudes are capable of movement or locomotion? Galileo, I admit that premise, yes, that nature is the principle of movement and that natural bodies and magnitudes are capable of movement. Simplicius of Cilicia. Now, falling back to geometrical propositions again. Do you admit that of lines, the straight and the circular are the only simple magnitudes? Or in other words, that the only kinds of simple lines are rectilinear and circular? Galileo, I cannot disagree with your statement. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then, tell me if you also agree that all movement in place, all locomotion as we call it, is either straight or circular or a combination of those two. Galileo, I also agree with that, yes. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then, do you agree that revolution about the center is circular motion, while upward and downward movements are in a straight line? Upward meaning motion away from the center, and downward meaning towards the center. Galileo, I agree, with the exception of rectilinear lateral motion, which I would rather not discount at this point of the argument. Simplicius of Cilicia. Well, rectilinear lateral motion is, in our conception, a composite motion, as there is no body there is no body with a natural inclination to lateral motion, opposed to another element, and a natural place of rest in one lateral place opposed to another, which would, upon emission, grant 4 additional elements to the upward and downward motions of fire and earth, as there are 4 cardinal directions which lateral motion would require to be occupied by different substances. Now, none of the natural philosophers admit 6 elemental bodies, about which it would be necessary to ascribe the natural motions of 4 cardinal lateral directions, along with the upward and downward motions of fire and earth. However, I suggest we leave off this point for the next segment, as we have not yet breached the span from geometrical to physical conceptions, upon which we will undoubtedly come to that problem. Galileo, then see to it that we return to this point. Simplicius of Cilicia, you have my word. So, in accordance with what was said before, as body found its completion in 3 dimensions, so its movement completes itself in 3 forms: the upward, the downward, and the circular. Galileo, that is not something I wish to contend with at this point of the argument. Simplicius of Cilicia, then to continue with the argument. We say bodies are either simple or compounded of such. And by simple bodies, I mean those which possess a principle of movement in their own nature, such as fire and earth with their kinds and whatever is akin to them. Necessarily then, movements also will be either simple or some sort of compound. Simple in the case of the simple bodies and compound in that of the composite. And motion is according to the prevailing element. Do you approve of that claim? Galileo, yes. So far as the argument has run its course, we Copernicans adopt all the aforesaid premises, even in our critique of the Aristotelians. Simplicius of Cilicia. Supposing then that there is such a thing as simple movement, and that circular motion is simple, and that both the movement of a simple body is simple, and simple movement is of a simple body, then there must necessarily be some simple body which moves naturally and in virtue of its own nature with a circular movement. Do you agree or disagree with that syllogism? I will repeat that. Supposing then that there is such a thing as simple movement, and that circular motion is simple, and that both the movement of a simple body is simple, and simple movement is of a simple body, then there must necessarily be some simple body which moves naturally and in virtue of its own nature with a circular movement. Do you agree or disagree with that syllogism? Galileo. I agree that there is circular movement natural to some simple body at the very least. And I and others also claim that circular movement is natural to Earth and to indeed all other bodies that aren't merely parts. Simplicius of Cilicia. So far, we need not contend about what substance or what substances have circular motion as their natural impulse. However, we are bound to contend about that point in due time. The argument so far only concludes that there is some body that moves naturally and in virtue of its own nature with a circular movement. Galileo. Then we can deal with that later. Simplicius of Cilicia. That would be more appropriate. Here is another premise about which I must ask your consent to. If you would say that unnatural or forced motion, if you would say that unnatural or forced motion is the contrary of the natural motion of the same substance. Galileo, I would. Simplicius of Cilicia. And would you also say that a thing can have no more than one contrary? Galileo, that is not a point I wish to argue about. Simplicius of Cilicia. As for instance, the case with upward and downward movements, which are natural and unnatural to fire and earth respectively. Galileo, of the parts of fire and earth, do you mean? Simplicius of Cilicia. Yes. Galileo. Then I agree. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then we agree. And the opposition between fire and earth and their motions, is that not due to their naturally contrary positions of rest, upward or downward along the same rectilinear lines? Galileo, that is clear. Simplicius of Cilicia. And the natural or Simplicius of Cilicia. And the unnatural or forced motion of earth and bodies is upwards, while the unnatural motion of fire is downwards. Is that right? Galileo, yes, from our perspective. Simplicius of Cilicia. Now, circular motion doesn't have as its contrary. Now, circular motion doesn't have as its contrary any rectilinear motion, does it? For we agreed that a thing can only have a single contrary, and further, that the unnatural and forced motion of a substance is motion in the contrary direction to that by which it moves in virtue of its nature towards its natural position of rest. Then, since rectilinear motion towards and away from the center are contrary to each other, and natural and unnatural to earth and fire, respectively, and a single thing can only have one contrary, then circular motion won't be contrary to either of the rectilinear motions, neither of fire away from the center, nor of earth towards the center. Galileo, I follow the argument. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then we again are led to the conclusion that there must be some simple body different from fire and earth as well as from air and water, which naturally moves circularly, as fire moves naturally upward and earth downward. Galileo, I see how that conclusion is drawn. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then also, neither will whatever body has the natural impulse of circular motion be the contrary of any of the simple bodies that have a rectilinear principle of motion. Can you deny that, Galileo? I suppose not. Simplicius of Cilicia. And I need not even pose the question whether or not the perfection and completeness of circular magnitudes in comparison to rectilinear magnitudes, and the vast distance of the revolutions of the celestial heavens from our mortal place on earth, as well as the incommensurate beauty of the bodies carried around in circles, make reasonable our conviction in their divinity. Galileo, then I need not answer. Simplicius of Cilicia. Well, in any case, I will give you other questions to answer. Galileo, go on then. Simplicius of Cilicia. Do you accept the following definitions? By the term heavy, I mean that which moves naturally towards the center. By the term light, I mean that which moves naturally away from the center. Galileo, from what center? Simplicius of Cilicia. Never mind that. If you wish to quarrel about the position of the earth as regards to the cosmos, that doesn't affect the use of the defined terms. For we both assume the term heavy to apply to things that move towards the center of the earth, regardless of its place at either the center of the cosmos or wherever you would wish to place it in the Copernican view. And we both assume the term light to apply to things that move naturally away from the center, however that center may be conceived. Galileo, then I accept the terms heavy and light as you define them, at least for the course of the argument. Simplicius of Cilicia. Now, everything which has a principle of motion and it moves naturally upwards or downwards possesses lightness or heaviness or both, but not both relatively to the same thing. I'll repeat that. Now, everything which has a principle of motion and moves naturally upwards or downwards possesses lightness or heaviness or both, but not both relative to the same thing. For things are heavy and light relative to one another. Air, for instance, is light relatively to water, and water is light relatively to earth. Is that agreeable to you? Galileo, I don't see why not. Simplicius of Cilicia. But the body which moves in a circle doesn't move either towards or away from the center, as circular motion was defined to be around the center, unlike the species of rectilinear motion, which move towards or away from the center, depending on whether they are downward or upward. Didn't we agree to that? Galileo, we did. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then the body which moves in a circle, that cannot possibly possess heaviness or lightness, as those terms were agreed to designate bodies that move naturally towards or away from the center. Is that right? Galileo, I suppose that is right, yes. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then to move on to the next point, I ask you if you agree that everything that comes to be, whether that comes to be from a contrary and some substratum and passes away likewise in a substratum by the action of a contrary into a contrary. Galileo, I have no reason to contend with the premise at this point. Simplicius of Cilicia. And you would say, would you not, that the motions of contraries are contrary? Galileo, they must be. Simplicius of Cilicia. If then this body can have no contrary, because there can be no contrary motion to the circular, nature seems justly to have exempt from contraries the body which is ungenerated and indestructible. Do you accept the conclusion? Galileo. Well, I wish to contend with the premise that there can be no contrary motion to the circular. As to the conclusion that the body that has as its nature circular motion is ungenerated and indestructible, I would also like to contend with, on the basis that the premise from which it's drawn isn't clear. Simplicius of Cilicia. First, it is clear to everyone that the two forms of rectilinear motion are opposed to one another by reason of their places. For up and down is a difference and a contrary opposition in place. Then we know that a single thing can only have one contrary. So neither upward nor downward motion can be contrary to circular motion, as they are contrary to each other by virtue of opposition of place and by weight and lightness. We also agreed that the only forms of simple motion are the circular and straight. We also agreed that the only forms of simple motion are the circular and straight. The latter, the straight, being further divisible into upward and downward. So, if the different forms of simple rectilinear motion are opposed to each other, and circular is the only kind of simple motion left without a contrary to another simple motion. For a simple motion could not be contrary to a composite motion. Then it is obvious that circular motion has no contrary, especially since circular motion isn't divisible into species the way rectilinear motion is divisible into the upward and downward. And since we know that fire is the simple body that has the principle of motion, perhaps lightness that leads it upwards, and that earth is the simple body that has the principle of motion, perhaps heaviness that leads it downwards. We can be sure that the simple body that is neither endowed with lightness nor heaviness, and which moves circularly, is exempt from contrariety. Since again, it doesn't even possess an attribute like lightness or heaviness to be disposed thereby in opposition to some other body which possesses the contrary attribute. Galileo, I accept that account. However, might not the motions in different ways along a circle be contrary to each other? Simplicius of Cilicia. The first thing that should be said in response to your question is that so long as you admit that circular motion isn't contrary to any rectilinear motion, and we designate the various elements to different species of rectilinear motions, we are nonetheless dealing with the celestial bodies amongst themselves, not the elemental bodies, and have advanced to or past the lunar sphere of sublunary elements. Now, your suggested question requires a solution in any case. If we take 2 points along a circle located at opposite ends of its diameter, and we suppose 2 contrary rotations against each other from and towards those points, see what follows. It is important to note that the 2 points are considered as being opposed only in terms of their place It is important to note that the 2 points are considered as being opposed in terms of their place only by the diameter, since we invariably regard the distance between 2 points as the length of the straight line that joins them, and not of some arc. And we consider contraries to be the furthest points from each other along a rectilinear continuum. A motion along a straight line to and from contrary ends has to stop and turn back before leaving one end and setting off towards the other, while a circular motion passes through both quote unquote opposing ends of an infinite number of diameters in a single round. For the circular motion goes from the same point towards the same point without breaking, without stopping and turning back. And contrary motion was distinguished as motion from a contrary to a contrary. Thus, the primary difference between the 2 cases is that the 2 opposite ends of the diameter are passed through with a single continuous circular motion, whereas the rectilinear motion, say along a diameter which intersects the same circle, requires separate motions to go from one point to the other and to return again to the first point. So the formulation of the problem as one motion along a circumference as from A to B, and another supposed as contrary to the first as B to A along a circumference, A and B being opposite points of a diameter that divides the circumference, will render the term contrary somewhat meaningless if described as such, as the first motion from A to B will, without pausing and turning around with a second motion, also proceed from B to A in a continuous motion, a single continuous motion. And the second motion that we say goes the other way from B to A, upon passing A will proceed again from A to B in a single continuous motion without turning back and without stopping for a second motion. So, in a sense, they will both be going from A to B and from B to A in a single motion without turning back with a second motion and without stopping. There is admittedly a sense in which these motions are different. These motions in different directions along a circumference. Yet their difference won't hold to the requirements of the definition of contrarieties. For circular motion is primarily regarded as going from the same point towards the same point. And contrary motion was distinguished as movement from a contrary to a contrary, from one point to a different point, those being contraries. That is to say, that circular motion can have no contrary, neither rectilinear motion nor circular motion in the other direction along the same circumference. Galileo. I accept the argument with hesitation and reserve, however. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then we are at liberty to return to the conclusion which was postponed until the premise in question was clarified. Galileo. I suppose so. Simplicius of Cilicia. The syllogism was as follows. If then this body can have no contrary, because there can be no contrary motion to the circular, nature seems justly to have exempted from contraries the body which was ungenerated and indestructible. Perhaps you would prefer if I garnish the argument with a rhetorical charm and dress it up in a fine Tyrian cloak of speech. Our theory of the eternality of the heavens seems to confirm the phenomena and to be confirmed by the account also that we have inherited from our ancestors. For all men have some conception of the nature of the gods, and all who believe in the existence of gods at all, whether barbarian or Greek, agree in allotting the highest place to the deity, surely because they suppose that immortal is linked with immortal and regard any other supposition as impossible. If then there is, as there certainly is, anything divine, what we have just said about the primary bodily substance was well said. The mere evidence of our senses is enough to convince us of this, at least with human certainty. For in the whole range of time past, so far as our inherited records reach, no change appears to have taken place either in the whole scheme of the outermost heaven or in any of its proper parts. The name, too, of that body seems to have been handed down right to the name, too, of that body seems to have been handed down right to our own day from our distant ancestors who conceived of it in a fashion which we have been expressing, implying that the primary body is something else beyond and different from earth, fire, air, and water. They gave the highest place that name of ether, derived from the fact that it, quote, runs always for an eternity of time. Galileo. I am under the impression that I have been led to admit more than I wish. For while I thought you were asking about mathematical propositions, I was led to admit a great deal more than I would like to admit about physics. And all the while, you barely let me speak, besides in either affirmation or denial. I might have as well simply nodded my approval or shook my head in disapproval, rather than say anything. I would like to take back some of the admissions I made to your questions. For at the time, I did not see the direction you were leading me through the argument. And I will stop there, but I want to say that you can find every one of the arguments made so far and every one of the responses are directly from Aristotle's On the Heavens and directly from Galileo's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, which are shown in the footnotes, the excessive footnotes that are there for that reason, to show that their responses, that Galileo's responses, that Aristotle's arguments, or that the Aristotelian arguments are exactly as they were portrayed by those authors.